Okay, let's see. Good, wonderful, live. Some of you may have had as much trouble getting into the conference center as we did today. Congratulations for making it here, both through the rain and through the electronic scanner. We're going to be talking about education today, and it's a topic that all of us feel that we have something important to say about. After all, we were all educated at one point. And we've seen a lot of that during this week. We've seen a lot of sessions where young people and older people have advocated for their own style of education as a style of education that would really be better for everybody else in the world. And we've also seen a lot of suggestions during the week that the technology of yesterday is not going to train the students and the workers of tomorrow. So the focus on 21st century job skills has us reflecting on whether educational technology, that pencil, that laptop, is going to be sufficient to produce the range of job skills that are going to be needed in a new and difficult job market. What we're going to be talking about on this panel today is that is, the nature of the technology used for education and whether that technology is sufficient in today's classroom or whether there's something new we need to design. If there is something new we need to design, should we think of it more in terms of promise or peril? What might we be leaving out in terms of how it's going to destroy our children's minds, our families, and society as we know it? That's the first axis. And then the second axis is one of the things that characterizes the typical, if there's a typical Davos attendee, is that he or she has often had a very broad range of experiences. Often when I talk to people, I'm struck by how many jobs they've had, how many positions they've had, how many different kinds of educational experiences they've had. And the second axis we're going to talk about is sequentially whether that has prepared you to be the global rock stars you all are, to have gotten access to the World Economic Forum, or whether simultaneously a different range of experiences is going to be important to train the leaders of tomorrow. What exactly is it in terms of life experiences as well as educational technology that's going to turn the next generation into the superhuman workers capable of dealing with robots taking over their jobs, countries leaving their moorings, and the other challenges faced by students graduating today. So on the panel, we're very lucky to have a broad range of global rock stars. I'm going to start with Randall Munroe, very well-known cartoonist and author, who's going to be sharing a cartoon that he drew especially for this purpose. Andrew Fursman, who is the CEO of 1Qubit, which is a quantum technology company. And Mei Lee, who is currently the Dean of Management and Entrepreneurship at ShanghaiTech. What's striking is that Randall Munroe, well-known cartoonist, also worked at NASA. And Andrew Fursman, well-known serial entrepreneur, also has degrees in philosophy and political science, has worked in government, and had a broad range of other experiences. And May has been a trader on Wall Street. I always, with my accent, that always sounds like traitor. A trader on Wall Street.
Some people on Wall Street might move you as a trader, that's okay.
A lawyer, an innovator in higher education, and I've worked as a fishmonger. I spent a decade doing an apprenticeship in metalsmithing and jewelry, and have worked in a number of different fields before my current position as the Associate Dean of Technology, Strategy, and Impact in Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. So we're going to set the stage for this discussion by looking at a cartoon that Randall was kind enough to develop just for this purpose. And it's going to remind us of where, when we think about where we're going. Randall.
All right. So let's see. So I draw comics about, a lot of the time about technology and particularly complaining about technology. And I frequently complain about technology myself, all kinds of aspects of it. And so I thought, since I don't really know anything about, I don't have any formal background in education or in the future of education, I thought it might be interesting to look at the past. And so I've been collecting things people had to say about technology and how it's affecting us and how we're working with it in society and how it's changing how we learn and think. And I wanted to take a look at a few of those. So for starters, here is a quote about how newspapers and the speed of modern life has made us so that we have no time to talk to each other anymore. And in particular, that when we're reading our newspapers on the train cars, we sulkily read as we travel, which leaves us no time to talk with the friends who may be sharing the compartment with us. And this is from 1886. Now, here's one about how now with media, the way media is breaking everything down into tiny fragments, we're all just getting these literary nips. We're not developing any kind of sustained ability. And sure, people are writing a lot, but they're all writing badly. And this is from 1891. Now here's a complaint that everyone is just dipping into all these subjects, but not sitting down to read any novels or read anything thoroughly. And this is from 1894. Here's a complaint that says that today nothing is left to the imagination because we're so surrounded by media. And we're surrounded by so much information that our own brains are dwindling because we're too supported by all the available media and technology, which is 1894. And then here's one saying that we're developing mental and nervous disorders, that we have all these anxieties, mental problems, and lots of medication, things that didn't exist in the past. And this is due to the hurry and excitement of modern life, especially the globalization and global communication. And this is 1895. And then, so this is about how newspapers now cater only to increasing their readership rather than focusing on the public good and educating. And this is leading to these perverted tastes and vicious tendencies from 1898. And my favorite, I think, is that our modern family gathering, everyone sits around at the table, but they only read. They don't talk to each other anymore. And this is because we've banished the teaching of good conversation and colloquy from the schools, 1907. And then, let's see, one more. That 100 years ago, it was so difficult to write letters that we had to spend time on them and think about what we were doing. But now, the rapid communication means that we'll just dash off these quick notes to each other, and we don't take time to phrase things well or think about what we're writing, because we're just going to be following it up with something else. And this is 1915. So I don't know what things we're going to be, how technology is, what it's going to be like in 5 years, let alone in 20 or 50 years. But I have a pretty good idea what things we're going to be complaining about.
Thank you, Randall. So I think what we've learned from this is that there is one consistent trait that characterizes humanity, and that is complaining. A friend of mine, David Mindell, who's a historian of science and technology at MIT, has shared a wonderful anecdote with me about the Singer sewing machine company. Singer was asked to turn to the ammunitions trade during the Second World War. So during the Second World War, Singer US made ammunitions. They made guns and other kinds of munitions. And after the war, they realized that they couldn't simply turn their trade back to sewing machines right away. It wasn't going to work that much and work that well, and they didn't want to waste all of the infrastructure they had put in place, and they asked how they might be of help to the US government and how they might get their business back to where it was beforehand. And they came up with this fabulous idea. There were so many soldiers coming back from the war who were going to need to receive an education. They had basically lost the years in their lives where they would have learned a trade. How were we going to educate them all? We had no room in our schools. And so Singer decided to radicalize education with a piece of technology which they claimed would be able to personalize and globalize education at exactly the same time, and would change the nature and the scope of education forever. And no, they didn't invent the first MOOC. They invented that technology, which all of you know did indeed change education forever, and that's the film strip. Now, if you don't believe that that radicalized education, that it changed it forever, and I don't think it did, I think it was on its way out when I was in school, then you know that what we're going to invent today is probably not going to stick around any longer. So I guess I would ask the panelists, what enhancements to education have you seen come along and leave, and what lessons would you draw from those brief encounters with revolutionizing education? Let's start with you, Andrew.
Yeah. One of my close friends is an executive from a place called Singularity University. And I had the opportunity to be a student there in 2010. And they're always looking to sort of rethink how education is consumed and distributed and how it can become bigger and larger. And I'm always interested in watching, because that's a big part of their mission, is to spread more education to more people, especially about these exponentially growing technologies. But then I think about sort of my own background, and while we're all interested in developing the best neural nets and making our neural nets be the best they can be, when I think about my own experience in academia, I actually think that some of the basic things like reading philosophy texts have actually been the most enriching and have given me the most context to be able to think critically about all of these different technologies that are coming along. So although it's important, I think, to stay abreast of the momentary advances and to try and understand exactly how all of these technologies are impacting us, I am not as down on traditional education as I think many of my peers, because without having that foundation of, I spent more time in undergrad than any sane person should, but I also look back at that as some of the fondest times of my life, not just for the extracurriculars, but also for the actual content. And I feel like that foundation has allowed me to really enjoy and to understand much more and to have context, much like your last little history lesson here. So I feel like there's probably a great role for these individual advancements, but that the traditional history of education is not something that we want to sort of completely dump away through this process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want to build on what Andrew said, and I sort of trained as a historian as an undergrad and worked as a lawyer for many years, so I appreciate the historical concept, but as a lawyer I always like the idea of identifying the issues. And I think in these conversations we spend a lot of time conflating two different things. And what Andrew said is absolutely right. I think educators, corporate CEOs, entrepreneurs all believe fundamentally that education still requires the same abilities of being able to read and write and think. I think the issue is the model of education hasn't changed, and the speed of rate of technology change combined with, I think, the scale of people we have to educate, and then if you add the third axis of our increasing knowledge of how people learn, has sort of a confluence of various trends that sort of causes people to talk about these things as if they're one, when in fact they're three. So technology maybe changes the model, maybe changes how we teach, maybe changes how people learn. the number of people we need to educate in this world has also pushed, because the education model has worked really well for the last 300 years. Because first we went from the elite to mass education that we know in the last 50 years, let's say in the US. But now with technology, we can imagine training children in rural areas of China, of Africa, in South America, where they may or may not have electricity or water, but can have access to education because of technology. And I think those are three very different sets of issues, and technology can answer different parts of that. But I have to say, I heartily agree with Andrew, at the risk of sounding like my mother and an old fuddy-duddy. I think the basics still need to be taught, and I think those will hold true this century and the next.
It's so wonderful. Here we are on the very last morning of China Davos 2016. We've spent the week trying on head-mounted displays and visual retinal displays, and we've been walking around. I wanted to try and put this image up, but as we walked along the hall, May and I, there was a group of people entirely immersed in their own environments, all with their heads covered. And we're going to have spent a week interacting with lifelike robots, with socially aware personal assistants, with virtual reality. And then on the last day, we're going to turn back into the Luddites we are deep inside. Randall, can I ask you to add to this?
Yeah. I think one thing I just would want to sort of add into this is that I think is really worth keeping in mind here, is that I think there are some changes going on around this technology, around the changing technologies and how people use them. Sort of the kind of thing that I'm making fun of a little bit there in my in the collection of quotes, but that's that. We are writing so much more than we ever did, and I'm have no doubt at all that the average person is so much better at writing now than they were 10 years ago, just because so much of our communication is written, and similarly photography. Everyone is now a photographer, and we sort of like laugh at Instagram and things like that, but that it's a medium that all of a sudden the entire world is getting an education in and learning to use and learning to express ideas in and learning to, becoming literate in. And I think that's sort of happening under our feet, maybe without paying quite as much attention to it as we could. And that when we're talking about the future of education and the ways we that we talk about all this, that whether it's following along with that or encouraging that might be a big component.
It's an excellent point. One of the newspaper clippings from the past that I hold on to is a complaint in the early 20th century about the effect of the telegraph on children's writing skills, and that they would no longer be able to write full words, they would only be able to use abbreviations. And it's something that seems so laughable today because we think that it just happened, that our children are incapable of writing. But it's not the case. I agree with you. On the contrary, our children are writing far more than they ever have before. I think about all the talks that I used to be asked to give to librarians and to parents about the perils that television posed for children's writing. They're never going to write another thank you letter to grandma. How can I get my child to write me letters from camp? And we have no space to complain about that anymore because our children are writing constantly. That is a very good point.
Still not to their parents, but that's completely separate.
Still no thank you.
Yeah, there are so many complaints about spelling and about, like no one knows how to spell anymore. And it seems so strange to me that people don't realize that, before the internet, I would never have had occasion to see a 13-year-old's opinion on Metallica or whatever expressed in a YouTube comment. So I would never have known what a terrible speller they were. But yeah, I think it's purely a matter of suddenly we're exposed to these, people's writing that we wouldn't have seen before.
Right, that's wonderful. While you're on this topic of writing, your own work as an author is strikingly a combination of the written and the visual. And do you think that that's an outgrowth of your own education, of your peculiar way of thinking? Is it something you would advocate for learners today? Tell us a little bit about it.
I have no idea what I would advocate for learners today. I think I draw comics, and still with stick figures. It's not like I have a artistic training, but I read comics constantly, all the time as a kid. Things like Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield, and so I sort of learned that language, I guess, and that. But oftentimes I was reading those during class when I was supposed to be learning something else. But I think it's like any medium. It's something that as you become familiar with it, you're able to then express yourself in it. And I don't know if there's anything better or worse about comics than about other poetry or writing or photography or videos. YouTube videos. There are all these media, and I don't know how much we can compare them against each other, but we can certainly look at the successful examples in each and see what we can learn from them.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Andrew, is there anything from your own personal training that's given you a different mode of expression, as Randall put it?
Yeah, I mean, as much as the comic strip that you had, I think was funny, it's also, to a degree, it struck me as like a little bit like, well, maybe these guys were just prophetic, because some of those things did seem like, they have manifest themselves more directly in society today. And I know that those quotes go back to, like BC, and you can find amazing Greeks that were concerned with the same trends. So I think there's lots to make fun of, but it's also the case that the values that we have and the things that we focus on really do change the skills that we pursue, and that some of the skills that we used to value, when I read people's writing from the 1700s, it's particularly long-winded, and I think like, oh my God, this is a paragraph, not a sentence, and so that just changes. And I think that there's definitely an acceptance of the fact that we live in a time that is more transitory in terms of, what you might have seen over the course of an entire lifetime, necessitated by changes in technology 200 years ago, might happen in a decade. Or I'm always surprised when I think about like, wait, when was it that I got my first smartphone and that I had a keyboard attached to a screen attached to me at all times, and realizing actually that came after high school for me, and that the people in high school are going to have a very different experience. So I definitely think that while it's the case that there are some things that go by the wayside that maybe we can lament, the benefits that come from these technologies, I feel outweigh them. I was just looking at an app the other day that you just load up and place on top of the piano. It listens to you playing the piano and shows you what keys to place. And so with no piano teacher, and in fact, if you don't have a piano, there's little keys that you can play on the machines. That's an awesome tool for somebody who maybe doesn't have space or the money to be able to afford a big old, real world piece of wood and string. And it's great to be able to see that you can actually learn these things directly through this other medium. So I'm excited to see those opportunities. I also think about how, I went through the traditional education system. I thought that I had a good grasp of history, but I started watching something called Crash Course. And I know that it's an alumni of Davos that's really sort of behind that effort as well. I learned, I think, more about world history and American history from that YouTube channel than I have.
Jot this down, everybody. Crash Course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's my favorite infotainment, but with a real emphasis on the info part. And that's something that definitely just wasn't available to me at the age of my high school years. And I think of what an amazing resource that is. So if Twitter is ruining our ability to write paragraph-length sentences, at least it comes with a connection to all of the world's knowledge packaged in a nice digestible format that allows people to really consume it and to reflect upon it in an easy way.
Yeah, and that I would just tack on to that. One of my youngest friends who I worked with for a while, at one point I walked into a room where there was a piano, and he was playing this beautiful, extremely intricate, piano piece, and I said, and it was very fast and very, very complex, and I said, oh wow, this is really cool. When did you do music? And he says, oh, I don't know how to read music, and I said, okay, where did you learn this? And he said, well, I found YouTube videos of people playing it in slow motion and mimicked. And just at my, I got a little keyboard at my desk, and he said, I'd just been doing that for a while. And that completely, blew me away, realizing that this is the kind of thing people have thought to do with these media.
So I think that I might take a slightly different view, or maybe not different, but an orthogonal view, which is, I think what we fail to do is to, in fact, appreciate what technology can bring without spending the same amount of time analyzing what it takes away and figuring out how to put that together. I think the speed of change that we're seeing now is so much faster and so much scarier that it's not that those complaints weren't true then, it's just that, as you say, it took 20 years or 50 years, and now it's 5 years or a year. And I think the experience of China over the last 30 years is actually a metaphor. Because when we talk about generations in China, it's not the standard economic definition of a generation. It's not 24 years. We now see dramatic change in perspective in every 5-year age difference, which is extraordinary when you think about the implications for education, for society, for companies, as employers, as employees. That rate of change is frightening. And I think as educators, we have to think about what the technology brings. So learning how to play a piece by copying is an amazing skill for one part of the brain, but not knowing how to read the music means that you miss an enormous amount of what music is about when you don't have that. So how to think about that more holistically, I think, is what we do. In other words, I think the complaints are legitimate, and I think the optimism is legitimate. What I worry about is that the discourse doesn't appropriately bring those things together to think about how we systemically go forward.
What I like, though, is that if you think about something like the mimicking of the piano, maybe that's going to inspire someone to be interested in something that otherwise would have been unavailable to them. And then this really starts as the beginning, right? I mean, you hear people thinking about conferences like this. This is definitely something I've heard about the sort of singularity classes that I'd taken previously. It's not a deep dive into a subject matter. Being able to watch a 1-hour lecture or a TED Talk is not going to make you into the world's leading expert on X, Y, and Z topics. But what I've really appreciated from them is that they gave me the ability to know about something that I wanted to later dive into. And I think that what will change in the future is, education used to act as almost like a badge and a sort of a certification as opposed to a process of becoming educated. And I'm glad that seems to be going by the wayside, not the least of which is because I have to confess that I am still one German degree short of that philosophy. So I can't really claim that I have that Bachelor of Arts. And luckily, that hasn't really held me back in the way that I think it might have previously. So I think that the idea of being able to know more about what's out there before you dive into that sort of deep and immersive experience is important, but it's also important to actually have that deeper dive to go into it. And the purpose of that shouldn't be to be branded as a degree holder. It's to actually have gone through the enriching experience and to acquire those skills.
So let's address that head on before we open it up to the audience. And just to get you thinking about what I'm going to ask you, for the moment, we've been very vague about technology. We really haven't said what technology is, and since this is a perfectly good educational technology, I'd like to hear what you're thinking about when you think about 21st century educational technologies. I know it's hard to recognize in its early form. But YouTube has been mentioned, the internet kind of generally has been mentioned, smartphones, texting, but let's try and get a little bit more concrete in a moment. For the moment though, I love the point that you brought up about education as product versus process. And you pointed out the benefits of process over product. You don't necessarily need to get a degree. I do worry, however, and I see the effect on my own students, of the number of role models that our students are faced with who have dropped out of college and become very famous and very wealthy. And my students continually come to see me and ask me why they need to finish their degrees. Wouldn't it be much more educational for them to drop out now, in whatever year that happens to be, and go start a company that's fabulously successful? And I have to point out to them that not everybody who dropped out of college came up with a company that was fabulously successful and ended up tremendously wealthy. That's just not yes, right, exactly. It's not causal in any way. Do you think that there's a kind of a dilettantism in this process approach to education that either opens the world to studying those things that we need, regardless of what the degree requires from us, or are we instead encouraging students to study a little bit of everything and not do that deep dive?
So I do worry a little bit. You know, in education, particularly in higher ed, we talk about training T-shaped people. The traditional liberal arts education is one where you traditionally pick a major and you go deep, but we also train you very broadly. I think that the process question is an interesting one. When I said that I thought the model should be examined from every perspective, I actually include the 4 years, the 12 years, the degree. I think the degree and the certification serves as a quality control piece, and how we think about what that should be, I think should be up for grabs and discussion. I think, do we need 4 years of college? That can also be, so for instance, Stanford just did a 2025 study at the direction of John Hennessy, the president, and they talk about continual life education. So they say that a Stanford education should actually be 5 years over the course of your life. So you can come at any point in time, spend 2 years, go away, come back. I think those models are all absolutely ripe for discussion, but I think that the idea that people must have, at least in our current brains and plasticity, the training in a certain amount of time to learn one discipline deeply is the bedrock of then being able to do all the things that you all have been able to do. I think that without knowledge, you can't actually then think about things more broadly.
Right.
As you said the word dilettante, the face of one of my mentors, and Graham knows who he is, popped into my mind from the accusation. So I think that there's definitely a danger to that. But on the other hand, you know, I dropped out of my first year of university, and when I later came back, it took me 9 years to finish that first undergrad degree with a little bit of time in Silicon Valley in between. And I came back to it with a completely different attitude towards education. At first, for me, it was about going to get the degree to get the job, and once the job was available, I didn't need the degree anymore. When I later came back to finish that degree, it was because I wanted the experience of learning the things that I had missed through that process. And I feel that that's an awesome reason to be able to go to school. What I worry about is the fact that with, you know, billions of people maybe not having the luxury of being born into a process that streamlines them into an Ivy League university, technology really seems to offer an amazing way for those people to be able to get many of the benefits that come from the experiences that hundreds of years ago were only available through these higher educational institutions. And I feel like many of the people that are working to try and redefine education, it's not necessarily an indictment of the traditional system. It's a method of saying, look, if we want to be able to make this technology exponential, if we want to try and get the process of education to be on the same scaling curve as most of the other things that we're familiar with now, we can't exponentially scale professors. You know, we can't do things in that way, but there are things that are enabled by technology which can enable that. So I see them as a nice complementary mix, and I would love to be in a future world and to be able to see people taking advantage of traditional educational institutions, but I think that they'll probably also be augmenting that with Crash Course. And for the people who aren't able to do one, then hopefully there will be the other.
That's great. Randall, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I'd just add on that in any of these conversations about the technology, I think it's good to try to keep an eye on first the question of what is the technology replacing, and whether it's really, like is the dilettantism or is the learning the music from a YouTube video, is that replacing the alternative type of education, or is that replacing TV time or exercise or what, if I had to guess which of my friends is the most likely to learn music in the next 10 years, like to learn to read music, I might go with the friend who learned to play from YouTube, because my other friends didn't express haven't expressed that interest. And so I'd sort of like, it would be, I'm sure, you have answers to some of this, but like I would want to know about whether sort of the research suggests, that there is less of the kind of deep dive education, when there's more of the, dilettantism, or is there just more of both?
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you bring up, and it's a
Yes.
good segue into opening the conversation. We do know from research on MOOCs, for example, that students who watch videotaped lectures are likely to, in vast numbers, the effect is very significant. So students who watch videotaped lectures are likely to go away believing that the lecture showed them that what they believed beforehand was true.
Ah.
Yes.
So we know, of course, all of us know by now that of the people who start taking online courses, only 5% of them will finish those courses. Of that 5%, the vast majority will be students who already have one or several degrees. So online courses don't work for students who don't have an education. And we know that for students who don't have a prior degree and who watch those lectures, they believe that their beliefs have been confirmed by the lectures, not that they've learned something new.
Right.
And it brings us back to some fundamental points about education, that education is not a vessel into which knowledge is poured. I'm sorry to say. We can't just get some kind of funnel that we stick into our ear or into a new hole in the top of our heads and into which a new subject matter can be poured. In fact, the process of education is a process of cognitive conflict.
Right.
We must start with a misbelief and have that misbelief overturned through being forced to confront
Yes.
an alternative opinion. That is the technical definition of education. That's how learning happens. And it also means, it points out to us that learning is deeply social. That kind of cognitive conflict happens best when a student is challenged by another student or by a teacher.
Yeah.
And the reason that the kinds of educational technologies that I build resemble peers is because of the importance of the role of peers in education. So young people will take from a peer, whether that peer is real or a virtual human, a sentence like, "That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. I can't believe you think that." It's not something that teachers are taught to say, and it doesn't really go over so well when
Really?
they do. That imbalance of power has quite a different effect on the student than when that's said by a peer. So cognitive conflict, deeply social, and avoiding confirmation of beliefs. These are some of the fundamentals that we need to keep in mind as we design new technology. I'm going to open it up and then come back to you. So let me open it up and ask you about technologies you're wondering about experiences you've had. Yes.
I'm pretty glad. So it's interesting you talk about the online technologies because my daughter was ill and had to drop out of high school after one semester. She could not go to a traditional classroom, and so now she picked up the GED book, she studied it, got her GED, and now she's enrolled in online college. But what I notice about her, she's 20 years old, that social piece is so missing. She missed that formative peer interaction. So I'd be curious, and that worries me about this, because now she's actually very isolated, and her health has come back, but she still finds herself more comfortable in this cocoon. That's one of the things that I really get afraid of. How do we combat that with the technology? How do we balance that?
So we have a tendency to think that education is about cognitive matters, math and science, but education includes what's called SEL, socio-emotional learning. And what you're talking about here is the need for SEL skills to be acquired during what are called critical periods, those periods in a child's development or young person's development, where if those aspects of learning are not acquired, they're harder to acquire later on. Yep. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Brian Michael Galvin. I'm a journalist from Beijing Review. I disagree with the conventional methods of teaching, and I'm in favor of the Socratic method instead. So previously, Ms. Cassell had talked about the potential of using VR technology to enhance curiosity in children as a way to promote learning. So I was wondering, could the panelists please explain how the Socratic method can be adapted into present and future online learning? So first is online. And the second question is kind of like, can it or should it be implemented in the classroom as in the future as a main method of learning? And if so, how would children be tested? Thank you.
Okay, so as a lawyer, I just have to say that I disagree with the premise of the question, which is that Socratic method is not, in fact, part of traditional teaching. I think, in fact, it's the core of how all good teachers teach. So, I mean, I had to endure 3 years of it. Maybe that's more than any normal person should want to do. But I do think that the idea of question and answer, the very heart of what Justine just talked about, this sort of learning of cognitive conflict, is, in fact, the essence of the Socratic method. And I think that every good teacher and every good learner inherently engages in that process if they're in fact truly learning. I think when you say traditional learning, you mean the professor standing at the front and everybody listening. And I think that actually online technology does offer an opportunity to change that. I think we have to make a distinction between knowledge, which you get reading textbooks, you learn in so Crash Course, it is amazing for those of us who are kind of endlessly curious. You can cram giant amounts of knowledge in a very short period of time. But that knowledge, as I said, is the precursor to the actual learning and the thinking and the discussion that happens. I have seen advancements in MOOCs. I should say that I think MOOCs are sort of like AOL, which is it's very 1.0. I think it's sort of the first foray, but doesn't nearly explore the possibility of what technology can bring as we see, and I think the piece we haven't talked about is how students learn, right? So there's a lot of talk about customized learning. Justine was saying that there are students who are saying, I want to drop out. I think now we have the luxury of saying maybe people can learn the way that suits them best, and that our system should try to figure out how to accommodate that. But I do think that things like VR with the future iteration of MOOCs can do much more Q&A than is currently happening.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I can also be loud. So I have a question. So it's, again, sort of maybe building off of what you were talking about, this idea of this, it sort of strikes me that there's really two aspects to things. For example, you learn in traditional school, right? You learn, things about the world or about, you get knowledge, but you also learn how to interact with people. And you learn, how to form teams and stuff like that.
Or not.
But
Yeah.
you presumably have to spend time with other people. No, seriously, you have to spend time with other people. And it's interesting, again, I'm just thinking about my personal experience, because, one of my sons, he's, again, like academically, he's very smart, and he tends to, want to spend time by himself. But that one of the things and one of the reasons why I want to, that I think it's important, and I'm sort of curious what experts would have to say on the topic, that I want him to be in school with people his age and just go with them, is because I feel like you learn things we don't maybe traditionally value in terms of how to form relationships, how to lead a team. That I think it seems like a lot of the technology that are being developed today don't factor that in. I think that sort of gets to your point. And I'm sort of curious if you either are seeing things out there that are starting to do that, or when we talk about scaling this up, how can that be incorporated into those ideas?
Excellent question. And I'm thinking of work here by one of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, Chinmay Kulkarni, who's a recent PhD from Stanford University, and who has shown that the kinds of MOOC discussion rooms that he builds that bring people from around the world result in higher learning gains than discussion rooms that have students from one region or one demographic only. And difference is an aspect of cognitive conflict. Being confronted with difference. We talk about diversity in schools and in workplaces as if it's a moral imperative, and it is a moral imperative. It's also smart. It's also the right thing to do, because it's when we're faced with difference that we learn. So that's one of the things that has to be taken into account, but that the developers of new educational technologies are beginning to take into account. In my own work, I build virtual children, virtual peers, and they are, the reason I began building them is because of their rightness for teaching cooperation and collaboration skills in ways that lectures can't and teachers can't. Yep.
So thank you very much. I'm going to start with an analogy and then come to my question. You know, we always think that there are three groups of teachers out there. Those teachers that usually when they teach, they just lecture. And those group of teachers that when they teach, they explain. And those group of teachers, when they teach, they inspire. I think there's the last group here of teachers that were always trying to build a sense of curiosity for the students. Because this is what is so important about learning, is that the moment you do not have a sense of curiosity, a sense of wonder, that's the end of learning. And I think this is a challenge about technology. How can technology instill this sense of wonder, a sense of curiosity?
Excellent question.
Thank you.
Excellent question.
So I think we've talked about education as if it's one sort of mono thing, but in fact, as Justine would tell you, and as research tells you, people learn in different ways at different stages in their lives. But I think one thing is unquestionably clear, and that is at the youngest ages, let's say through 6 or 7, children learn through playing. That's actually how they indulge their curiosity. It's actually how they learn about each other. It's how they learn about their physical world, and it's where their curiosity starts. And I think if we were to look just simply at early education, what I would say is if we were going to change anything, we should make sure that more children are allowed to play outside, kayaking, in playgrounds. If they want to play and look at videos and then do music, I think any mechanism that allows a child to just explore openly at those very early stages is critical to a foundation that then the educational system can think about cultivating from first grade onwards. But I just have to say that I think there's more and more push. My 2-year-old should learn his or her letters. My 3-year-old should learn his or her multiplication tables. There's no research that I know of that says that that's actually additive or even an indicator to somebody's future academic achievement or life achievement. I think early education is about, I think if you look at the people on this panel, I spent endless hours just playing, throwing things around, breaking things, taking radios apart, riding my bike, but I think very little of it, to my mother's chagrin and my father, was actually learning math or my letters. I read endlessly because I was curious, and they let me do that.
I'd love to chime in on that to say that one of the things we've been talking about when we say education is really sort of that process of filling the noggin with information.
Right.
And the other seems to be kind of a conversation about socialization. And the traditional educational system has a very specific kind of socialization that goes with it. And in fact, different educational models seem to have different socializations that go with them as well. I had an opportunity to do some grad school in China. And as the non-Chinese educated person, I noticed a huge difference in the way that I had been socialized through education, and I definitely stood out. I put up my hand and answered many questions wrong, to the horror of my classmates, who were sort of like, oh my God, I can't believe you just embarrassed yourself terribly. Luckily, I'm pretty comfortable with this. But it was something where, I realized I was much weaker in many of the hard skills than my classmates. But they were really uncomfortable with taking the risks to use those skills.
Absolutely.
And so I think that that's a pretty stark contrast, and there's definitely been a big dichotomy between the Chinese educational system and the North American educational system that I've grown up in. But both of them have socialized the students in very different ways, and they've had different effects, and those effects are probably as profound as the content that we've learned. So as we're thinking about the future of education, thinking about how that education will be socializing us, I think is a big component of what needs to be considered.
That's wonderful. I have the feeling that we may need to end this conversation, and it feels much too soon. But we've gotten a set of points here. We've come to a particular place, and I want to reiterate those points because I think they're so important. We're, this week particularly, feeling like we live in a very uncertain world where a lot of the things that we've depended on have come unmoored. And in that uncertain world, while we prepare education for a new age, what I hear is we're still, while we're changing the media through which education is conveyed, the message is the same. We want to come back to those basics of education. Be wrong, be curious, engage with others, even be conflictual, and explore. Explore using everything that you have to hand. Online videos, your friends, the people who live down the street. And that's a lovely message because it lets us remember that all of these new technologies give us new ways of accessing important tools in an education. However, we as people are fundamentally the same. We have different needs at different ages. We will always have a need to interact with others. We'll always have a need to explore the frontiers of our experience and to explore them in such a way that we don't always get that right. So thank you for engaging in this conversation, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.